or just how practice has been, all that kind of stuff, do drop them in the chat. Then when we're done, in the end, I'm not going to be able to do the review of our own games because I don't have the replays right now and I can't organize them while we're also on stream. So I'm going to jump straight from that into a review of T1 versus Gen G. So we looked at T1 before. We're going to check in with their progress and see how they do in later stages as well. So first things, I've got a couple things that I'll talk about, but as I say, anything you want to ask, do feel free to put it in the chat, either on YouTube or on Twitch. First thing is we have a week off this week, so I want to talk a little bit about that and how I would approach that situation. It's a little bit different with what we're doing to what you would normally want to do in a situation like that. But basically, because we won last week, we have a bye week this week. So today and tomorrow, NLC is going to be on, but it's going to be lower bracket games, and we're still not in the lower bracket. Next week, what will happen is we're going to have a best of 3 on Thursday. And if we win that, we'll go straight into a best of 5 on Friday. So if we do win, it'll be most likely, based on how things have gone so far, a best of 5 against Lost Ratones on Friday, which should be an incredibly fun match to be a part of and just great to get to match up against them properly rather than just the BO1 from the group. So when you have a week off, it does allow you to dive a little bit deeper into things. What you're doing as a coach in esports, especially when we're competing each week, is you're kind of balancing what we need to progress as a team, but also what we need to do to perform well at the end of this week. Now, because our timeframes are so short and splits are so short, but also contracts around those splits are so short, results always have to matter. Now, from a development point of view, we'd love to be able to say, okay, right, winter split is about learning and developing, and we're going to focus primarily on that. And then we're trying to be as good as possible in summer, or we're trying to be as good as possible next year, or whatever that might be. But it's really, unfortunately, not something that we can do when it actually comes to like the practical day-to-day of coaching, because people judge so quickly, because changes happen so fast. For example, SK and Rogue might well make changes after those like 3 weeks of competition, and you don't know that they're not going to, even if you went for something different. So when we have these bye weeks, we can maybe start to ignore some things that we would want to do in terms of performance. So that gives us like, right, we don't need to practice so much in terms of the things to make ourselves as good as possible this Friday. But what we can do is try and integrate some new champions into our pool. So as you've been noticing, have been experimenting a bit more with stuff like the Jace, or trying a few more like dive specific comps, which might not be something that we will do in the future, but this is the perfect time to try it, because we don't have to be doing every game as in how will we be as best as possible on the weekend. So that's been our approach to taking the bye week. I think if it was a full-time team, if it was a non-streaming team, I think I would have gone even more for that. Taking the opportunity to do a little bit more stuff in terms of the team culture. Do another kind of check-in with where we are and where we want to get to. Things that I've talked about before. But because we've got to always balance the streaming, unfortunately, that's not something that we can do. So we can't be streaming that kind of stuff. Everyone's remote. Everyone's got streaming, or Freddie especially has got streaming contracts that he needs to fulfill. Sorry. So we have had to keep scrimming, and in those scrims, we now get to try a few like different things. So that moves me on to something that we started doing yesterday, which we'll continue to do going forward, which is moving from rather just a very democratic system to more of a dedicated shot caller, which is what we're doing going forward. So Treats is going to be primarily in charge of making our team calls for the mid and late game, but it doesn't mean that other people are going to be quiet. So I can talk about the benefits or the downsides of either system, but that's one of the things that we've been allowed to do because we don't have to keep like playing for this weekend. So we can try it out, we can see how it works, and then we can look to change and adapt it going into next week. I think probably whatever system you pick, you're going to have to adapt it to what's best for you as a group of 5 or 6+ if you include the coaches. But some kind of hierarchy is almost always useful. The thing that my approach to communication structures are in general is I would say I want it to be as light as possible. Because what happens is if you add too much rigidity or you add too many like systems, not only you have the risk of overloading your players and putting too much on that mental stack, but you also have the downside of what happens, like you kill the creativity, you kill the like extra unique parts that everyone can bring if you start to have it too like regimented. So what we've had a problem with in the past is people making calls and not following them, other people not following them. And the downside is that then you do half of two different things and you can't say which was better because we don't even do one of them properly. So maybe we didn't have time to rush this objective, or maybe we did, and we don't know because we didn't actually rush it. We did it slowly, and then it was just the worst of both. So what we're doing for now is we're going to be moving to having a kind of more primary shot caller. When Treat says something, we're going to go for it. And even though he sees the game slightly differently from some of the other players, he's obviously going to make mistakes when it comes to shot calling as well as making great calls. But it's still better to do it like that, because for me, that means you get to actually learn something. So that's one of the things that we're doing in this week off, and going to keep looking at for next week. It'll be about, okay, where does everyone else's information come if that's the case? Like, are we just keep feeding information back? What if you see something completely different, which will happen? Do you fully override the call? Is that even possible? If he's going to be like more hierarchical about it, all these kind of questions I think are very good ones to explore for the future. But we can't do that until we just agree on a system. So that's the moving to a set shot caller. Then I can talk briefly about the possibility of going to best of 5 fearless. Now, as you've seen from our scrims, that the thing that's difficult practicing for these 5-game fearless sets is that 5th scrim is always difficult. It's always messy. It's always a bit silly. It's very likely to be not a particularly productive scrim. Because you've been playing for that whole day, because you've been doing these intensive reviews in between the games, and you don't have the adrenaline that you would have in a best of 5. So a normal best of 5 is not necessarily 5th game is worse, although probably worse standard, I think is fair. But doesn't necessarily need to be as messy as possible. The old classic was to just always draft scaling in game 5, but that's maybe not quite so true anymore as teams are getting a little better. So I think prioritizing comfort is a good thing, although of course you won't be able to do that by the time you get to best of 5 fearless. But so our 5th games in scrims are likely to be pretty messy and pretty strange anyway. And now we're doing the fearless version of it too. So doing 5 games fearless in scrims doesn't directly, I think, teach us about doing 5 games in a competitive setting, but it is still useful. Now, even with all that, you'll have seen that once we get to game 5, it's really hard to find drafts and find specific things and specific matchups, and some strange stuff can become quite strong and quite, OP. I did touch on this the other day and just recently made a short about it, which will be going out soon, or already is out maybe on YouTube. But in best of 3 fearless, which is what LEC is moving to and what we've done, I think fearless doesn't make all that much difference. So it does make a difference in the sense of you don't see the same champions. But the thing that I think it shows or does normally is just test the depth of your pool. But you'll probably still be going for like meta champions. Meta champions, as I've said many times, are mostly meta because they're hard to counter and they're flexible rather than they're super, super strong or something like that. Now, Vio and people like that are a bit of an exception. She's not particularly flexible and she isn't particularly hard to counter, but it just depends on the strength of this like peel back stuff. So there can be other things that do come into the balance, of course, but very important to, like, in these best of 3 fearlesses, it's more like, right, we're just doing different meta drafts. Whereas when you get to best of 5, if we do get to game 4 and 5, then you can start to get a bit more wacky because the counters to your specific weird thing might be gone, or maybe like all the good dive champs are gone. So then what do you do? Like, how does that change actually the meta? Does poke just become completely OP, or does therefore front to back becomes OP because people are going to do poke, or, all those kind of things. So that's going to be a really fun one to get used to, and hopefully, against Lost Tones, I'd like a 3-0, but it'd be fun to go the full 5 as well, just to see the fearless. Really like the idea of the primary shot caller, because if someone's sharing his thoughts calls all the time, it seems if relieve some of the other players because they don't have to think about. Yeah, that can be really impactful, and we can see in even other teams, there's players who in certain teams they can just mechanically perform really well because they've got nothing else to worry about. Now, I don't think you're ever going to have that in a short situation, in a situation like we've got, like in a really short time frame. But it is a good idea. Like having a primary shot caller can give you some benefits like that, where other people just can focus on their lane. The downside is that primary shot caller is never going to be as good as if you could somehow have all the information and all the good side of having 5 people talking, but not have any of the downside. Like, as in, if you could be really short, but we still get the best idea from everybody, that would be amazing. But unfortunately, that's not the situation that we can ever really live with. So that's one of the downsides of having a primary shot caller, is that maybe, okay, in our case, Tamas or Lucas might see the game in a different way, and maybe they're closer to the truth. And if we did their call, it would be better. But the problem is that if we don't have a primary shot caller at the moment, we're running into the situation of doing half and half. So I think what will happen is that we will be primarily following treats for now, and I think it will gradually soften. That would be my guess. You can quote me on that if in a couple of weeks' time we'll be a bit more in between. But that will be, I think, probably the most likely scenario. Really helps in this team and the current situation. Yeah, I think it should. The downside that we have is, like I say, few people do see the game quite differently from Eric specifically. So it'll be an interesting one to like keep the balance of, or keep in mind, and that has to be something that from my side I'll keep paying like close attention to. So it'll be good to see tomorrow's scrims doing the whole block with that. With slightly more dominant voice. Although, again, you also have this slight thing of you can't always do it if he's behind. He can't do it in the early game necessarily. All those kind of things. So it's always a hard balance. We used to have on Solari when first tower fell, and again, went from jungle to support. I think the downside of having a support do it in the mid and late stages of the game is that the game works on tempo. At least my version of the game, my way of seeing the game works primarily on tempo, and each person's tempo is obviously different levels of important. In the early stage of the game, in a normal lane, like without the swaps, the jungler's tempo is the most important, because they're the one who's going to be able to like dictate where you're overloading or where you're having less people. But in the later stages of the game, it's normally actually like your mid laner's tempo is the most important. And so having a mid laner who can be the primary shot caller can be very, very beneficial. And the downside is that the support with the timers that we play on are going to have to be like, we're going to have to find how to balance what timers to play on, because sometimes we don't want to just give up a side lane so that we can play in mid if the side lane is more important. And in a lot of teams, you do have that where the mid laner has a bigger voice in the later stages of the game, because that's normally the side lane that normally has the most like pressure and the one that you want to play towards. So obviously so many variables in that, and every team will be very different. But something to consider for us going forward is that when we're not having our side laner as a predominant voice, we need to make sure that the people that we do have on side lane, so Tamas and Freddy, are also confident enough to say, no, we need to deal with this wave. Like, we can't do this, we can't group here. I don't know how it works yet, but do you work with strong win conditions voices for mid-late game plans, or always with the same one? I'm not entirely sure what you mean by that, Largo. I don't know if you can provide a little bit of extra context. We often have different win conditions exactly with our comps. I was talking about this yesterday, actually, with Thomas. It's so much easier to draft if you know what your team wants to do. So we played Valiant the other day, and they have a very specific, like, they always drafted dive. every single game they drafted like dive comps, and they play those dive comps very well because they always draft them. Um, but the difference is that they're in best of one and they're not in fearless. So, well, because it's best of one, so it can't be fearless. So the problem is that if you go into a draft knowing that they're going to play dive, they're still going to be able to get to play dive, and they're always going to be able to ban stuff like Zyra or whatever, and that's your good counters to their composition and their win condition. But when you start getting to game 4 and game 5 of fearless, if it's like your third or fourth iteration plus bans of a dive comp, then you are going to start having some just very wonky champions that could be quite very one-dimensional, and could have some quite clear weaknesses, and those weaknesses could still be up. So it's hard to it's going to be hard to balance, but at the moment we are still being a bit flexible with the win conditions. I think we can do more on finding our specific identity and working out stuff that really doesn't work for us. Like, I think we're worse at dive, for example. So we might just slack off and do a little bit less of that. Slack off is the wrong word. Do less of that and focus more on other things. Okay, I mean, if the Fed carry in front to back says we should force, but the decisive shot caller says we go Nash, who are we choosing generally? So in this case, we're going to start choosing the decided shot caller, pre-decided shot caller. So it will be Treats. And then we have to work with him on making sure that he's making calls that suit our most fed person. So we had yesterday, for example, we had Lucas was 7-1 on Lilia, and we're forcing fights when he didn't have ult. So that's something that we just need to bear in mind. Now, this kind of stuff is much easier not in a scrim, because there's much less fights, there's much less tactics happening, there's much less instant reactions that you need. So it will be a bit easier to do this in the future. But for now, that's the way it's going to work. So the person who's the most fed, the person who's the most important in our win for our win condition, will still obviously talk a lot. But same hierarchy applies no matter who's the most fed. And, you know, Treats is never going to be the one who's the most fed. Well, actually, sometimes he has been, but in general, he's not going to be the one who's the most fed. So it'll always be the case where he has to just take into account how our comp wants to play. Yeah, no problem. Any other questions that anyone has, do always just drop them in. I've got a couple more things that I knew I wanted to discuss about things that we're doing a bit differently this week, but then we'll go as long as there's people with questions, and when we're done, we'll move on to the T1 thing. So won't necessarily be a set length for this. Which champs should No Way learn? Well, I think we've started doing some things with Jace. We're playing as of tomorrow. We're playing on new patch, and our competitive games will be the new patch, and they will have Mel enabled. I'm not sure what we'll do. What I'd like to do, I'm a little bit worried about when a new champ comes out and we're playing Fearless. If we get a chance to play it like once at Scrim, that's a bit, not enough, to be quite honest. But when... So what I might suggest to them is, can we say, right, we do full Fearless, but Mel is always in the game. So Mel doesn't have the Fearless rule, because I don't think she's that strong now after the really heavy nerfs. Like, the numbers are just really low. But I think she'll always be useful in certain specific situations. And so I'd like to play as and against it a bunch of times, because it could be quite important, but for both our series. So I will suggest that to them later today, and see what will happen, see if we are able to do that. But that's always something to learn. Like, when a new champion comes out, how do you play with it? How do you play against it? What kind of things does it do well with? What kind of things does it do poorly with? And all of those things, I think, are important. So other champs to No Way should learn. I mean, we need to look at the patch, because Jace was something that we had before, but it's been changed. So AD Jace is better and tank Jace is worse. I don't know what that does to him in the meta. That's something that we're going to keep looking at. Galio as well, nerfed, especially early. But I think stuff like Silas and things like Anyon, we can play more of. I don't think he needs to learn them, because he's been good on them. He's obviously had mistakes on them too, but maybe we could just integrate them more. That's not necessarily him learning it outside of scrims, but just integrating it more with what we're already doing. Will you or have you looked at the FlyQuest scrim? I haven't looked at it yet. I might. I'm not sure. They play quite a different like meta to us at the moment, but it could be something that's worth looking at. It's probably not a downside. I don't expect it to be a higher level of scrim than the Lost Return ones that we can look at, and of course that also helps with the scouting as well. So I will have a quick look probably and skim through. It'd be interesting to see how they do reviews when they're in person. How are they streaming those reviews? Because that's a one to balance. So we in the bootcamp couldn't get a proper review set up that would work as a stream as well, which is a shame. We could have a place that we all gathered around that would stream, or a place that we could look at the game together on the couch, but not stream it. Like there was no way to do both at the same time because it would have been a delay. So the problem is that meant that our group reviews were basically the same as if we were online, which was a bit silly. Coming from playing IRL sport, I've never liked having a shot caller. It can help in the short term, but it's not even guaranteed. If the calls are wrong, then the person is viewed as a scapegoat. I'd rather have everyone be on the same page. It depends on the sport though, doesn't it? For example, American football has a huge primary shot caller, and stuff like rugby is the same. As far as I know with American football, I can't remember which sport you're participating, because now I say that it might be American football, in which case isn't the quarterback your primary shot caller? Isn't that the same equivalent? It's not like no one else talks, but someone to like run the game. And for me, in a lot of sports, those can be like super crucial. You're like, I don't know, one of your midfielders, for example, is very common in football or soccer, however you talk about it. But for rugby, it's a lot like the halfbacks, the fly half and the scrum half, like running the pace of the game and deciding like how we're going to play. And of course, everyone should be on the same page with that, and they have more time to actually get on the same page. But you still start with someone making those calls, and then it can progress to everyone realizing like how we're going to play and what we're going to value. But for now, because the downside is that there's no ball in esports, right? In League of Legends especially. I mean, in Counter-Strike, I think games like that, there's more of a focus point. But everyone has their own different focus point, and so the communication around it can be, I think, a lot more spread. Like if you say, right, we're going to go, the classic things of like earn the right to go wide is something we say a lot in rugby. Like we're going to go narrow this many times before we make the call to decide to go wide. You still are all playing with that one ball, and so that's much easier to all easily get on the same page with. Whereas with League of Legends, I think we sometimes do have to just say, right, we have to all follow this call, and then later on we'll learn what page we want to be on and all those kind of things better from actually following a call than from not. But it is difficult to balance. So the other thing, last thing that I wanted to talk about, something that you saw a bit different in the last set of scrims, is we're putting a little bit more planning into the draft. So we are coming into drafts with specific ideas of like what we want to take and what we want to do with those things. So, okay, this is what we're going to take 1-2 on red side, but also this is how we want to build the rest of the comp. And I think that's a really good balance. I think the stuff that Thomas was doing yesterday was really, really useful, and spending some time in between games to really start to prepare out those last drafts. So each time we knew pretty much where every draft was going before we started it. And that's a really useful thing for me, and a really useful thing for the players. So I think that does allow us to have a bit more like assurance, I guess, on the stuff that we're taking. So those are all the things that I wanted to cover. If no one else has any other questions, we can just get into the other review. I'm still working out like when to do these. I think there's probably less people around at this stage. But yeah. Okay. One from the chat. What happens if someone disagrees with the shot caller? Did they still have to do the play, or can they just say no? Well, that was the thing that we were having a problem with before, where someone would disagree and then they would do their own thing. And then afterwards, they're doing their own thing and everyone else is doing, or 3 people are doing one thing, 2 people are doing their own thing. And now suddenly it like all kind of falls apart. So what we've decided now is we just follow the call. So You can, of course, say, I need to do this. You can provide extra information of like, no, I need to collect this wave. Like, I need to collect this wave safely. But if the shot caller insists, you say, no, we do this, you just do it. And then afterwards, we can go back and look, I think we should have done this. I think we should have done this play. I think I should have collected this wave on the side. So they will still follow the call. They will still do the play. The big one will be people like Matty having to drop waves because he obviously will prioritize waves a lot more than Eric will, just from the kind of players that they are and also the roles, of course, that they play. So that'll be the big one. And then afterwards, we can look back and say, okay, look, we gave up mid lane here and they ended up taking 2 towers for our play because we just didn't take the next wave and we could have played it slower. Or look, it worked. They didn't get that. They didn't get very much, and we got this big objective for just rushing to it and being really fast. So that will be the thing. The benefit will be, even if they disagree and they think it's a terrible call, then we'll at least see that it's a terrible call because they will actually do it, and then we'll see the massive downside that they lost. Whereas what we have at the moment is we can't see if it would work, and we can't see what we would have lost if we'd have done it, and we sort of lose a bit, and we also don't do the call. So that's the reason that we're trying something a little bit different. Okay, well, as I said, I'm doing these at a slightly different time each week, so it's not exactly like people can be around to ask questions. If you have any other questions and you're watching this on the VOD, you can just drop them down below, and I'll get to them. Either just reply to you on the YouTube, or I will put them into the next Q&A. Next time we'll have a Q&A after our 2 games this coming week. So 7 and 8 days from now, no, 8 and 9 days from now, Thursday, Friday. And we'll be able to talk about what's going to happen next once we know. So I'm going to stop the YouTube stream and then I'll restart it. Okay, wait, I'll get to this. I'll get to this question first because it's a good one. I feel like there were many instances where the early game the team fell behind. Is that an issue? I think actually our bigger issue has been the opposite. Sometimes we obviously fall behind in the early game, and sometimes we weren't on the same page in the early game. But our bigger problem, I think, is in the 10-minute window where we weren't making the same plays and we were doing different things, and some people were contesting this or some people weren't. So yesterday we did have a few times where, for example, we all committed to the weak side. Like we sent 2 people top lane, even though we should have known that they're there. And so we sometimes do make these early game mistakes that kind of throw the game. But in general, I think our problem has been more converting leads, and we've been in a lot of good situations that we haven't managed to close out at all or close out anywhere near as cleanly as we should. And that's where the shot caller hopefully will be beneficial. How do you feel about your place in the league? Do you think you have a chance to finish first? Absolutely. I think that both in terms of the roster and in terms of the development that we're on at the moment, I think we absolutely have a chance to contest for the top spot, and that's what we'd like to do. So we obviously would like to beat Verdant on Thursday and then get a chance to play to get into the final already. So if we lose to Verdant, we go into the loser bracket and we play the following week. If we win, we're already into the grand final weekend. So already guaranteed top 3 if we just win one more best of 3, which would be nice. But I'd like to get top 1 because I'd also like to go to EMEA Masters, as well as beating Casual's team would also be fun. Okay, so I'm going to turn off the YouTube stream very briefly just so I can restart with a new thumbnail, new title, all those kind of things. And with the Twitch, it'll just update automatically, and we'll get into T1 versus Gen G. Obviously, if you have more questions about NORD, it's not like I'm going to ignore them as we go. But thanks very much for watching. If you have any questions when you're watching this as a VOD, do put them down below, and I'll either answer them in the following Q&A or on the YouTube itself.